Hello wonderful person, this is Anton, and today we're going to discuss a relatively unusual discovery coming from a super distant galactic cluster. And in this case, a discovery of one of the largest cosmic structures based on radio observations. This is what's known as a radio halo, or basically a cloud formed by a lot of fast-moving particles, usually electrons, that produce such enormous emissions that they form this enormous cloud only visible to radio telescopes. And though these types of clouds and these types of emissions have been observed before, we have never seen anything this large. Here, from tip to tip, this is approximately 20 million light years, 200 times as large as the Milky Way galaxy. And so let's discuss this discovery and what this means in a little bit more detail, with the main focus being the study right here by the international team of scientists. And so in this study, researchers decided to focus on 3 massive galactic clusters, but specifically clusters known to be colliding: Abell 2744, the Bullet cluster, and Planck G287, with the Bullet cluster actually being the most famous of them all. This was the cluster where scientists have officially been able to observe the interactions of dark matter as opposed to visible matter. And specifically here, by looking at the X-rays and the visible light, a few decades back, researchers were able to establish that the majority of the mass in this galactic cluster seems to have essentially passed through without colliding with anything. Yet the visible matter seems to be lagging behind and is also producing a lot of these beautiful emissions. You can learn more about this in one of the previous videos on dark matter in the description below. But the main focus in the study was to use some of the most sensitive radio telescopes, such as MeerKAT and Giant Meter Wave Radio Telescope, to try to visualize what kind of radio emissions these galactic clusters were producing as a result of these very powerful collisions. Because here we're not just talking about collisions between 2 galaxies, we're talking about collisions between thousands of galaxies at the same time. Mostly because these are extremely massive and very large galactic clusters. And while some of the previous observations with previous studies already hinted on something somewhat strange. For example, very bright relics or giant shock waves that seem to become super bright on the edges of the clusters, implying very energetic interactions in locations where these shock waves were forming. But there was still something missing. These observations were not showing us radio halos or additional interactions that could only be seen to more sensitive telescopes. And this is indeed what became now visible to the researchers behind the study. For example, the Bullet cluster now revealed an enormous radio halo that was previously invisible as well. And here this halo was over 2 million light years in size, implying that such halos were definitely possible, even though at first it was not entirely clear how they were forming. But the biggest surprise came from a distance of 5 billion light years away from us. This is the object known as Planck G287.0 plus 32.9, a very massive galactic cluster that was first detected back in 2011. And here's actually how it was first seen in the optical light. And though at first this looked like another galactic cluster and did not appear to be anything special, this turned out to be an ongoing collision between 3 different subclusters that seem to be producing one of the most massive and one of the most violent intergalactic collisions. Something that was kind of hinted by earlier radio observations, but something that became extremely apparent when the researchers observed this with the X-rays. Here the X-ray emissions are visible in red. The earlier radio emissions are visible in blue, with the new observations combining all of this, essentially hinting on this being the largest radio halo we've ever seen, representing the largest cloud of extremely energetic particles that seems to be approximately 20 million light years across. And this is larger than the previous record holder, Abell 2255. This one is about 16.3 million light years across, so it's approximately 4 to 5 million light years smaller. But in essence, this shows us an extremely large cloud of charged particles, possibly cosmic ray electrons, interacting with magnetic fields and creating these very powerful emissions. But one of the reasons this was previously invisible was because of the limitations in terms of wavelengths. Here, some of these extended halos can only be visible at much lower frequencies because with time the electrons tend to lose energy and thus produce emissions that are not as easily detectable. And so seeing the radio emissions between 2 giant shock waves was previously impossible. But because of new radio telescopes, we can now see almost everything. And what we see seems to challenge some of the theories. And mostly theories in regards to what creates these charged particles and what keeps them energized for such a long time. Because we normally see something like this around really massive black holes, or possibly during some very powerful explosive events. But here this is between galaxies and is not powered by anything inside galaxies. So in essence, because of this detection, researchers now have to rethink how we believe energy and matter move inside these large structures. And so, for example, the X-rays seem to reveal this very bizarre box-shaped structure visible in purple with a comet-like tail. But radio observations show us other features, including the hot gas inside the cluster, implying that this cluster is highly disturbed. But because the X-ray observations do coincide with radio detections, here it suggests that these giant shockwaves and turbulence seem to be related and seem to be produced by accelerating and reaccelerating electrons, very likely the result of merger inside the galaxies and extreme turbulence all over the place. In essence, think of this as two waves colliding in the ocean and producing a lot of different eddies and a lot of turbulence all over the place. And so this region seems to be energized by giant shockwaves and turbulence. And most of this seems to be happening between galaxies, not inside galaxies. Which of course also suggests that there is a lot of stuff between these galactic clusters that would be previously invisible to us unless it started colliding. Which is why this particular detection is so exciting for cosmologists. It basically shows us where these galaxies are formed, how all of this is evolved, and how massive amounts of dust and gas seem to gather around galaxies, very likely inside the mysterious cosmic web. And what we might be seeing here is actually what happens at the intersection of these filaments, where we basically have a lot of galactic clusters merge all at once. And so in essence, what we might be seeing here is one of these cosmic web knots. Knots connecting several tendrils, where we do expect massive collisions producing massive emissions. And mostly because none of this really makes sense otherwise. The prediction was that this was going to produce some shockwaves, but nobody expected this whole cluster to be glowing in radio light, with the emissions that are being visible providing very strong evidence for the existence of cosmic ray electrons very likely interacting and being accelerated by very powerful magnetic fields that seem to form between these clusters. And so in some sense this is also maybe the first evidence we have for extremely powerful magnetic fields located between galaxies. Because otherwise a lot of this doesn't make sense. We have no idea how these electrons would be re-accelerated, thus producing all of these radio emissions. Except for magnetic fields, no other explanation currently makes sense. And so this could be the perfect sample to study cosmic magnetic fields, one of the biggest unanswered questions in cosmology. And by studying this cluster, it might help us understand how these magnetic fields shape the universe and of course what effects they might have on the rest of the universe. And because we're not seeing any other powerful emissions, such as for example emissions from black holes or really anything else that could produce these very bright radio halos, here the only explanation is once again magnetic fields. But exactly what produces these magnetic fields and how they are produced is of course still a mystery. Right now it's believed to be the result of the gas compression when a lot of the matter here collides. And so here these magnetic fields essentially start acting as particle accelerators, propelling electrons to nearly the speed of light. But the problem is that because of the size of this halo, this doesn't really make as much sense because something allows these cosmic rays to continuously retain energy and to continuously emit electrons over large distances. So there's definitely a lot of complex stuff going on that nobody can explain yet, which is why researchers behind the study also suspect there might be a lot of hidden galaxies in this cluster that we're just not seeing, which would potentially explain how these magnetic fields are maintained and how these effects are even possible. But because none of the theoretical models explain any of this just yet, right now this is just one of the new mysteries. The mystery of an enormous object, visible in radio light, that's roughly around 20 million light-years across, and the object produced by enormously powerful emissions, but the object produced by something we don't really understand. This is pretty much it. You can check out some of the previous videos on similar radio objects or additional discoveries in radio astronomy that make no sense in some of the previous videos in the description. Until then, thank you for watching, subscribe, come back tomorrow to learn something else, support this channel on Patreon where you can actually find additional videos and videos you might have never seen before, including videos with no ads, or maybe support this channel by joining the channel membership that does have some extra footage and early access. Or maybe just buy the Wonderful Person t-shirt you can find in the description. Stay wonderful, I'll see you tomorrow, and as always, bye bye.